Welcome back, everyone. We've had a fantastic morning and early afternoon session, and now on to a special symposium on ethnicity and COVID-19, with a special thanks to Abbott Pharma for sponsoring this symposium. And it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Professor Waseem Hanif, who is no stranger to this group as chair of the Diabetes Working Group of this foundation. Waseem is a professor of diabetes and endocrinology and head of service in diabetes at University Hospital Birmingham. He has had a distinguished career with multiple roles in national and international committees, roles with government, and he has won numerous accolades and awards, not the least the Lifetime Achievement Award from this foundation last year. Waseem has conducted impactful research for diabetes and ethnicity, and I think the floor is all yours, Waseem, to tell us about ethnicity and COVID, a really pressing issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nita, for the kind introduction. So before I start off, this is an Abbott-sponsored symposium, but I just want to declare Abbott had no role in the preparation of slides, neither I was paid any fees for the symposium. So I'm thankful for Abbott for being kind and considerate to do this symposium on this important topic. Now, what I'm going to do today, as we have been at numerous SAHF conferences for over 2 decades now, this is our first virtual conference. Now, one of the things, although I was enjoying the conference, the one thing I was missing was the banter which we usually had between the speakers and the chairs. So I will try and bring back a little bit of banter, although we're talking about a very serious issue here. Now, ethnicity and COVID. So what I'm going to be doing is, when I was asked to do this presentation could have been done much better and much more lucid by my dear friend, Professor Kamlesh Kunti, but he kind of thrust this on me. So I'm really grateful for him. But what I will be doing today is, although I'm going to be talking about the evidence, so there are 2 parts of the presentation. The first part is looking at the evidence, and the second part of it, which I think is very important, is talking about the recommendations which SAHF have made, the SAHF report, on how to tackle the issue of ethnicity and COVID. Now, the way I planned this presentation was to give you the story of how ethnicity and COVID got linked. So this is the story of SAHF, and give you a kind of a prelude as to how it happened. Now, one of the most important things that we have done in SAHF over a number of years is to ask pertinent questions, especially regarding health inequalities. Now, when we frame these questions, I think it is very important that we ask the right questions. Maybe we don't have the answers, but the whole point of asking those questions is to start the conversations, as the conversation with ethnicity and COVID started. So let me take you back to March, when the pandemic actually hit the UK. Now, before the pandemic actually hit the UK, most of the countries that were affected by the pandemic were what you would call a very homogeneous society, be it China or Italy. And what was coming out from those countries, from the published literature, was that COVID was a disease of elderly. It was a respiratory disease, and that was the message that was coming in. When it came to the UK, and especially in Birmingham, where I was working in the front line. So when I finished my kind of a first shift of 4 days on the front line, I had this telephone call with Kamlesh. And what was very interesting was, although we were seeing elderly patients who were coming with severe COVID and getting admitted and going, unfortunately, to ITU for ventilation and sadly dying as well, what was very apparent was there was a large group of middle-aged South Asian men. So that was the thing that we were seeing. And after this conversation with Kamlesh, I think Kamlesh did call our other networks to make sure that to find out whether the same phenomenon was happening in other parts of the country. And the reports that we're getting from the networks was, yes, it was disproportionately affecting the South Asian communities. And I still remember this tweet from Kamlesh suggesting that. And as always happens, that whenever you talk about ethnicity, you develop a certain amount of antibodies. And there was a little bit of chiding saying that you are unnecessarily trying to scare the people. But following this, the next week, the ICNR report of the ITU data came in. And that also indicated, without any reason, that a third of the patients admitted to ITU were from the BAME communities, which was quite disproportionate. Now, this was the background. So very early on in the course of the disease, this was the editorial that Kamlesh and I, along with Avdesh Kumar Singh from India, did in BMJ, basically asking, is ethnicity linked to the incidence or outcomes of COVID? Now, there was a very little data to say this, except the ICNR data and some data. We suggested some possible mechanisms, be it the usual vitamin D, to the ACE polymorphism, to some of the genetic links that could be to the usual things like social deprivation, underlying burden of disease that could be driving this. At the same time, we also did, and this was with Manish Parekh, we kind of published a meta-analysis to see what the data was saying. So by that time, there were about 600 papers on COVID, and only, as it always happens with ethnicity, only about 5 papers mentioned anything around ethnicity or the South Asian issue. And then we had this lovely publication from Jonathan Walladji, Partaka, Kamlesh, along with the ONS data, and that was some real data, actually showing a number of factors. So the first thing that was obvious was that if you had type 2 diabetes, your risk of dying from COVID was increased twofold, although the absolute risk was small. If you had type 1 diabetes, it was increased by 3.5-fold. But what was very obvious was the age. So if you were above 80, your risk of dying was nearly 9 times higher. But it also suggested that when it came to ethnicity, there was a link. So if you were of black heritage, your risk of dying was increased by nearly 78%, and if you were Asian, your risk of dying was increased by nearly 30%. Now, from Birmingham, this was from the University Hospital Birmingham, where I work, and we had a large group of patients admitted. And the initial publication that came in, it had about nearly 2,200 patients. Majority of them were male, nearly 70% were white, and majority of them, 80%, had comorbidities. But this was an ethnicity paper, so it actually looked at South Asians because this was the predominant group. So we had nearly 20% of South Asian ethnicity. And these patients were more likely to be younger and had more comorbidities, but twice the prevalence of diabetes when compared to the white patients. So we had about 25% in white patients, nearly 50% in diabetes. And if you look at the SAR and SMR, suggested more admissions and death in South Asian patients than would be predicted. And they were more likely to have severe disease, despite, and this is very, very important, despite no delay in presentations and symptom outset. Because most of the time with South Asians, you think there was a delay, there was no delay in presenting. And these South Asians was associated with increased risk of death, about 40%. And this was after adjusting for age, sex, deprivation, and comorbidity, and by propensity score matching, suggesting there was this increased risk that was seen in the South Asian cohort. And if you look at the survival curves based on ethnicity, what we clearly find is that if you're of Asian ethnicity, your risk of dying was much higher from the Birmingham data. Now, we wanted to look at this data a bit more closely, a bit more granularly, and we wanted to see whether it was just the diabetes in the population that was driving the death, or was there something other than diabetes? So in this group, what we divided was patients without diabetes, and then compared them with diabetes without complications and diabetes with complications. And when we say diabetes with complications, this was based on the ICD coding. So most of them had what we would call the microvascular complications of diabetes. And what it showed was that if you just had diabetes without complications, your risk of dying from COVID with diabetes was pretty small and statistically not significant. But if you had complications from diabetes, be it mostly microvascular, your risk of dying was nearly increased by 40%. This was again something, initially this is in a press paper. One of the things that became obvious was the presentation of DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, in people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So in this analysis, although small numbers, we looked at patients in the same period of time of the year in the non-COVID to the COVID phase and looked at type 1 and type 2 diabetes. In people with type 1 diabetes, there was no increased risk of DKA on admission when compared to the pre-COVID era. But in people with type 2 diabetes, there was nearly doubling of the presentations of the DKA. We know people with type 2 diabetes generally don't present with DKA, but there was doubling of the risk. And this is especially true in a South Asian context when most of our patients have got type 2 diabetes. We can talk about why this happened, what the mechanisms are, but this was interesting. Now, then we also looked at the other data, and this is from Lasaine's group, and they basically looked at the COVID-19 and hospitalization risk. This is from the UK Biobank of nearly 340,000 patients, and it said that if you compare the black population compared to the white populations, there was nearly a 2.5-fold increased risk of hospitalization. And when it came to the South Asian patients, or the Asian patients as they describe it, there was a 40% more risk of you being hospitalized when compared to the white patients. Similarly, when we look at the mortality data, and this is confirming this increased risk of nearly 40% that we are seeing, and again, this shows a very similar linkage of nearly 40% increase, although there is difference among the South Asians, the highest being that for the Bangladeshi community, and the lowest being for the people of Indian heritage. Now, since then, there have been a number of publications, and I've cited that, but still, as you could see, we could only find, and this is in the review of literature, which we did for a report, about 8 publications from the initial 5 in this area. So again, suggesting a lot of work needs to be done. So although we talk about different things and social deprivation, stuff like that, what is the important thing? So this is a lovely review done by Fieldman, and there he talks about this a collision and collusion of two diseases, the perfect storm, which is between COVID-19 and diabetes. And there seems to be the chronic low-grade inflammation of diabetes, the cytokine surge of the COVID-19, both of them causing end organ or tissue damage, causing hyperglycemic surges, glucose variability, producing this increased mortality. So now, what are the challenges? So although we're talking about diabetes and COVID and the increased risk, one of the challenges that we have got is to try and deliver diabetes care during the time of COVID. And this is especially true for what we call the hard-to-reach communities, the BAME communities, the socially deprived communities. The access to the primary care is not face-to-face. Secondary care has become almost difficult or impossible. And therefore, it becomes very important that we don't forget our patients who have got diabetes without the COVID, because the consequences of this will be long-standing. Now, one of the other issues that had come up was what would happen with the lots of treatments. SGLT2 inhibitors, as we heard today, have been proposed as the drugs of choice or second-line drugs for a lot of patients, especially for South Asians. The SAHF diabetes guidelines, which are due to be published and were presented at the last conference, puts SGLT2 inhibitors more or less like first line in combination with metformin. And there was this concern about SGLT2 inhibitors causing TK, which is true, but also the susceptibility of COVID, and we are getting a lot of reports of patients being stopped on SGLT2 inhibitors. And this is one of the reviews based on the thin data, which showed when it comes to the risk of developing COVID, when compared to DPP4 and SGLT2 inhibitors, there is no increased risk, which is reassuring. We can use it, but of course, SGLT2 inhibitors have to be stopped if you become sick and get admitted. Similarly, with the metformin, I think it's the same story. Metformin, in some studies, have been found to be safe. In this analysis by Narendra Kumaran's group for Birmingham, it shows that it is safe, although statistically it's not beneficial, but it is safe to be used when it comes to the risk of COVID. And again, there have been a number of guidelines. This is the ABCD guidelines, just trying to give about what needs to be done when patients are admitted. Now, one of the issues that is important from a South Asian context is the use of steroids. Now, because of the recovery trial, we are seeing a huge benefit for the patients with COVID, about a 30% reduction in terms of their admissions. But the concern is about diabetes, including new diabetes, because most South Asians, at least 50% of them, have got what we would describe as pre-diabetes, and once they go on 8 milligrams of dexamethasone, the risk of diabetes is very high. So there is a brilliant protocol published by ABCD, and I think we should all follow this protocol when we are trying to see the patients. Now, one of the issues that was highlighted was the increased death rates among the BAME communities. Unfortunately, we lost a lot of our colleagues, and our heartfelt condolences and commiserations go out to their families. And there was a lot of concern about the increased mortality in the BAME communities in the healthcare professionals. Now, this is analysis which is led by Kamlesh, basically looking at COVID-19 cumulative mortality rates for frontline health worker staff in England. And although it showed there was increased death rates among the healthcare professionals when we compared to the white colleagues among the BAME communities, what was interesting was, to me, was the mortality rates were similar to those of the communities that they came from. And this is something very important to remember. If anything, the mortality rates were lower than the index communities. So while we were talking about this effect of ethnicity in the UK South Asians, this was the initial set of data, and everybody was very concerned what's going to happen when the pandemic hits the subcontinent, and it hit the subcontinent about 2 months after what we saw in the UK. But surprise, surprise, as always, the Indian subcontinent surprises you. The death rates in the subcontinent were extremely low, and I'm going to go into reasons for that. So it was like the risk of dying was more if you were Pakistani living in London than a Pakistani living in Lahore. And that is quite surprising, and that will make us wonder what are the reasons. A number of reasons have been suggested, and I'm just going to hypothesize on them. None of them have got very strong evidence. One is obvious one, the age of the populations. As we know, the mean age of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh is much younger population than in the UK, and that could be one of the reasons for the protection. There's always the BCG stories, whether the BCG has got protective effect, although we do vaccinate for BCG in this country if you're of South Asian heritage. But the question is that one of the reasons why we are seeing lower mortality? And again, there is again this thing about the underlying of previous TB infections, which is very common, whether that is offering some protection. And vitamin D is always props up its head There's the sunlight of the subcontinent that is protecting against the lower death rates. And there's always this northern hemisphere effect that most of this pandemic is playing out in the northern hemisphere, and somehow if you're around the equator, you're protected, and there've been a number of things. Now, one of the reasons which a lot of skeptic gives is less testing and reporting. But we in the UK cannot be proud of that. Our testing has not been brilliant, and our death rates reporting has changed about 2 or 3 times. So although we do need to agree that there might be less testing and less death reporting, but the death rates are far, far less in the subcontinent. Again, there's this whole issue about less virulent strain, whether the strain that is operating in the, or prevalent in the subcontinent is less virulent. There is very little good evidence to really support that. And finally, this is my one, is about the migration risk. We've always got this thing and issue around migration when it comes to long-term disease or cardiovascular disease or diabetes, that when people migrate, they carry the risk of their host country, of their original country, and then they pick up the risk of the host country, whether that is what is driving it. So here I'm going to suggest what I call, this for my friend Professor Vinod Patel, a Wasim Vinod study, where we look at people who are born in the subcontinent, born in this country, to see whether they have got different risk factors. So based on this background, the South Asian Health Foundation came up with a report which was based on evidence, review, and recommendations. So the background of this report was, as I mentioned, the increased risk seen in the BAME communities. The PhD published actually 2 reports about these disparities in June. But the recommendations to protect ethnic minorities were limited in scope and lacked detail, and proved no time frame or implementational methods. And that's why the SAHF report reviewed the evidence on ethnic minorities and the impact of COVID-19, and also tried to come up with the potential explanatory factors. And we not only came up with short-term recommendations, but we also ventured out to make long-term and cultural recommendations. So what are the disparities in and predictors in the COVID-19 risk? So we have talked about lifestyle, we have talked, and then there is the whole issue of deprivation, age, obesity again is something which is very, very important. Then one of the important issues that's not really come in is the whole issue around structural discrimination, where the structural discrimination is bringing out what we call the underlying burden of disease. And then the vitamin D is that genetics is always comes up, and never you find any genetic differences. Occupation is an important element. The chances are, if you're from the BAME communities, you mostly employed in the frontline staff, live in an inner city area with low deprivation, and this could be the only reason why it is driving the pandemic. So primary explanatory factors that we have come across is structural inequalities, be it socioeconomic deprivation, living in overcrowded, densely populated area, and key workers. And then there is the history of the existing health inequalities, and this is the work that SAHF has been doing over the last 2 decades, talking about the pre-existing comorbidities, be it diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity, and kidney disease, which is much more common. And also the suboptimal lifestyle behavior which drives comorbidities, example, physical activity and diet. And then we came up with recommendations. So some of them were the short-term recommendations, and these are very important. And I'm hoping that these will come into place while we're getting the second surge. One is the whole thing about culturally tailored public health messaging. Now, one of the important things about public health messaging is not only the language and the translation, but it being culturally appropriate about how these messages are conveyed. And then you need a tailored test, trace, and isolate strategy. And this should recognize the diversity and cultural sensitivity of these communities. And when we talk about these communities, we are also talking about people who are what we call undocumented migrants into this country and people who have come to seek refuge or asylum. It is important to recognize those people because the virus doesn't differentiate one human from the other. And then the whole issue about priority testing, and I'm going to come to this because there is this whole issue about ethnic minority workers, whether they should be given priority testing. And the whole question is that when you're asking for priority testing, you're asking for population you are at a risk. Similarly, as you would ask for an elderly population who are at risk. And then there's the whole thing about mandatory occupational risk assessment. I think Sridevi and I talked about the RCP tool. SAHF had developed, or members of the SAHF contributed and developed our own tool. A lot of these tools, assessments have been done, but the implementation across the country has not been very good, including the NHS. Research is again very important. As I showed you, the evidence is not very much there. Protecting migrants, I think, is something very important, and we should emphasize this again and again, especially in a toxic environment about the immigration and the various debates. And the close the immediate educational gaps, and this is quite important in terms of trying to bring the communities in together, and most importantly, to strengthen the science. In the long-term actions, and this is the pandemic, if anything, has brought in what we always had in the UK, long-term structural inequalities. This can only be addressed by having a common plan to tackle health inequality, occupational inequality, social security strengthening, and address the health inequality, housing inequality. We again have the issues of differential educational achievements, discrimination in the NHS, be it for people working in the NHS or accessing the NHS, and this whole issue around health literacy and lifestyle behavior. So I would recommend you to read this report. It is available at on the SAHF website. Now, one of the strengths of South Asian Health Foundation is that it has got a certain kudos to make cultural recommendations, which very few people do. So we have come up again with very detailed cultural recommendations depending around the places of worship, worshippers, religious festivals, and etc. And this not only gives details about people going into the places of worship, but also in terms of the festivals. And we know there is a number of festival seasons that are going to be coming up in the next couple of months. Similarly, it also has got detailed guidance around funerals and burials, which are again something which is very important from a cultural context to the South Asian to the South Asian population. And this is one of the infographics that has been that was developed, and I think Sarah Lee helped us a lot with this, and this has been used very, very widely in the communities and on the media. And so this is my kind of a summary of my talk. So what we really need, or our recommendations, we need a comprehensive multi-sectorial approach supported by strong policy action is needed. This should tackle the multiple and complex structural, biological, and behavioral reasons driving the disproportionate impact of COVID-19. Our recommendations are key to protecting ethnic minority communities from COVID-19 infections and reducing health inequalities related to COVID-19 outcome. Now, I was going to end my slide here. So the last slide I added today was after a tweet this morning from Kamlesh, and that drew a lot of comments along with from my good friend Partha. And this is the whole issue about if and when vaccines become available, who should we prioritize? And this is something that we've been thinking about, and it was good to hear from Jonathan that Kamlesh and Jonathan and others involved with CMO Professor Vitti to come up with some kind of guidance about the risk stratifications. And this is something we have been trying to write as a letter with Zaki. And this actually talks about priority groups for COVID-19 vaccination and preventable therapies and gives various levels and groups. And then brings about the ethnicity. And I think it's important to start having those conversations that when you are deciding to give vaccine, the important thing to consider, which are the populations that are likely to die. And if there is a certain amount of risk associated with this population, they should be vaccinated first, and we should not hold back in asking that question for political reasons or emotive reasons. I think that is what we should do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wasim. Great. So, Wasim, that was a fantastic summary of the magnitude of the issue and where the ethnic differences lie. And also you took us through some actions and recommendations for where to go next. Now, I'm sure there are lots of questions in the audience, but none have been posted that I can see. So let me start off with some questions of my own. Firstly, you touched upon the issue of participation in research. What do you think are the key challenges to get South Asians and other ethnic groups into research? And particularly for vaccine research, there was data just released very recently that only 7% of those who came forward were from BAME backgrounds. That's my first question.
Ali, that's a fantastic question, Nita, and I think this is something that we have to address, and we've been trying to address over a number of years. What is it about BAME communities, and I can talk more about the South Asian communities, as to why they don't take part in research? And Kamlesh has done a lot of work, and others as well. Now, one of the reasons, so when you talk to our colleagues, and a lot of them are joining from India, I think what we find is that when it comes to South Asians, say in the subcontinent, they are happy to take part in the clinical research. It is something unique about the UK South Asian communities that stops them or acts as a barrier to be part of the research clinical trials. We've been doing a lot of clinical trials among the South Asians for a very long time, recruiting patients for studies in Ramadan. Now, one of the things that has come back is it is not language. Even people who speak English very well, have been born into the country, second generation, third generation, don't take part into research. Now, one of the issues has been around trust. And the issue of trust is people generally have this perception that if you're doing research, you're treating them like guinea pigs. And I think this is something that is there in the community. And it will involve a lot of work for people like us, including the community leaders, to try and emphasize the importance of research and why we should be taking part in research. So I know it is a big issue.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So another question from me is, do you see any unintended consequences of highlighting the issues in the BAME communities, both in terms of perhaps inequalities themselves, but also with the risk assessment? Are there unintended consequences? Would more Asian doctors be told to sit at home and not work at a lower threshold, for instance?
The first unintended consequences, luckily you're not on social media, is the trolls. So if you're on Twitter and if you talk about these issues, you get the trolls. But we can live with it. Kamlesh and the others from SAHF will say that. One of the issues, and this is why the reason why in the report we have been very careful, is that we are not saying that if you're from South Asian context, you should be given special privileges. It is about trying to understand that risk and mitigating that risk. And I think it is important that we have these conversations. And I know at an individual level, it is difficult to have these conversations. I always use this example that, say, if you're a 70-year-old man, doesn't matter you're white or black, it's very easy for you to shield or to get if you're still working in the NHS, you can shield and no questions are asked. But if you're a, say, 55-year-old Bangladeshi doctor with diabetes who carries the same amount of risk, then those conversations become difficult. And I think we need to try and make sure that the risk assessment is fair, it's transparent, and it is to mitigate the risk.
That's Really helpful. Thank you for your insights on that. And I think we are perfectly timed now to move into our next session, but really to say thank you so much, Wasim. That was absolutely fantastic, very, very clear. And thanks again to the sponsors of this particular symposium, Abbott Pharma. Thank you.
So thank you. So I'm waiting for my colleague, Professor Kunti, to join me, and then we can invite Sonia.
Hi, can you hear me, Wasim?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Really great talk. Now we're on to our final session, the session that everyone waits for. This is our 21st South Asian Health Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award. And Wasim and I, as co-chair, would like to just say a few things about our recipient. The South Asian Health Foundation Lifetime Achievement Award is in recognition for individuals who've promoted South Asian health either through world-class research, improving clinical care, or advocacy. And it gives us great pleasure today to announce the recipient for this year, who is Professor Sonia Anand, who is Professor of Medicine and Epidemiology at McMaster University in Canada. She's also the Canada Research Chair in Ethnic Diversity and Cardiovascular Disease and Vascular Medicine Specialist in Hamilton Health Sciences at McMaster University. She's a prolific writer, has had a huge impact in terms of care, especially of women of South Asian health. She holds, runs a number of cohorts that are looking at birth cohorts in women of South Asian ethnicity and mixed ethnic health populations. She's also one of the key researchers in South Asian health from Canada. So Sonia, over to you. We are really delighted that you could make this and accept the award from us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's a distinct pleasure and an honor to be nominated and given this award. It is an incredible honor to be presenting amongst many, many esteemed colleagues here today who also are tirelessly working to help understand South Asians' risk for various conditions, including COVID-19. So thank you again for this opportunity. And I would like to share with you the past 20 years of the work that we've done in Canada. And this work started in Canada has also had global reach, and really try and end with what have we learned and how can we go forward and what are the questions of the future. And my objectives today are to focus on the dominant causes of diabetes in South Asians, to touch on whether omics, such as genomics and metabolomics, have increased our understanding of the causes of cardiometabolic risk factors in South Asians, and then end with how can we harness the vast and immense knowledge that has been created to actually improve health outcomes. Now, my interest in the field has a personal connection and also has intrigued me over the years. So my great-grandparents on my mother's side lived in Punjab and lived until their 80s. They lived quite simply, produced and consumed their own food. They walked often and had lots of fellow friends and family in their household all the time. And both of my grandparents lived until their 80s. My grandfather left the family home in search of better opportunities and ended up in East Africa and Uganda. And he was the first in the family to own an automobile. He took up smoking, and he also ate well with very little concern about where the next meal would come from. And unfortunately, he died early at age 57 of an MI, and his brother also died at a very young age. So we have this paradox of simple living with lots of activity and longevity compared to taking on the riches of an urbanized lifestyle and the toll it can take. When we look at the South Asian diaspora, every single country to which South Asians have migrated have observed the same pattern of early onset coronary heart disease and excess prevalence of type 2 diabetes. And when I started research about 24 years ago, we didn't have much data in Canada. And we first sought to determine if the same scenario played out amongst South Asians who, in Canada, represent the largest non-white ethnic group and the fastest growing non-white ethnic group in Canada. And if we look around the world at the global diabetes prevalence, we can see, and this audience knows well, that we have epidemic proportions of type 2 diabetes, and the projections for India and globally in 2045 are quite daunting, with the global estimate being over 500 million. Now, when we look at the global predictions and we focus in on India, you can see shaded as red as the hot spot. We can see that at present there are over 35 million individuals with type 2 diabetes. That's the entire population of Canada. And the predictions going forward is closer to 100 million individuals in the next 10 to 15 years with type 2 diabetes. So this is an urgent problem. Now, when we look back to ancient texts, it's quite informative what they knew and how similar their learnings and teachings were about a condition similar to type 2 diabetes or perhaps diabetes itself. So in the 2nd century, 8 Hindu texts were written, which, as I've taken a few excerpts from, will say eating heavy foods rich in fat and oils, saline substances, new grains, maybe that means refined grains, sweet juices in excessive amounts, along with oversleeping, little exercise, neglect and evacuation were identified as causes of madhumeha, which is equivalent to diabetes as most people's interpretation. They go on to say there's no end in the knowledge of medical science, and the physician must constantly learn and devote himself/herself to it. And they also go on to almost describe what we would consider a diabetes care team, a team of individuals focusing on diet, hygiene, prevention, medical education, involving physicians, nurse, and patient. So quite incredible that many of the principles we espouse today and believe we've learned from our research were present in the early 1st and 2nd century in India. Within Canada, our first study to try and understand if South Asians had more cardiometabolic risk factors and cardiovascular disease was the SHARE study. And in this study, we recruited a number of ethnic populations, and you can see those populations involved people of Chinese origin, European origin, South Asian, and Indigenous peoples of Canada. And within South Asians and Indigenous, we saw a very high prevalence of metabolic syndrome, in particular in women of those ethnic groups. And then if we focus here on the left at the comparison of South Asians to European origin Canadians, you will see a very similar picture to what you've observed in the UK. South Asians having a lower BMI, more type 2 diabetes, more cardiovascular disease compared to white Caucasians. We went on to measure carotid atherosclerosis using B-mode carotid ultrasound. And that demonstrated that in fact South Asians did not have excessive atherosclerosis, but for the same given amount of atherosclerosis compared to white Caucasians, they had significantly more cardiovascular events. So atherosclerosis was a component, but not the entire answer. We then looked to see, using factor analysis, how these cardiometabolic factors were connected. And you can see that the lipid factor and the glucose factor are connected through fatty acids, insulin, and other lipid factors, whereas the blood pressure factor clustered on its own and appeared to be independent. And our student, now colleague, Fahad Razak, published an analysis using the SHARE data showing that, in fact, the obesity cut point for South Asians, above which glucose starts to become elevated and lipids, was 21 compared to the obesity cutoff in white Caucasians of 30. So at that time, our understanding of obesity was one set of metrics can be applied to all ethnic populations, but in fact, we see the cut points differ depending on ethnicity. And you have all seen this slide, I'm sure, many times, and a picture tells 1,000 words, this demonstrating that for the same BMI, two colleagues of different ethnicity and physical activity have very different body fats, with the South Asians having the thin fat phenotype, relatively lower body mass index, and significantly more adiposity. So we were interested in moving from our population-based study into a mechanistic study to try and understand why it is that South Asians have excess adiposity. And we recruited deliberately South Asians matched to white Caucasians by BMI in 3 strata: low BMI, moderate or overweight category, and obese, and men and women in equal proportions. And we observed that overall the South Asians have greater abdominal obesity and more body fat, and as you may expect, significantly lower adiponectin. When we looked using CT scan of the abdomen and MR spectroscopy of the liver, we observed that the South Asians had more visceral adiposity and significantly more fatty liver. In particular, South Asian men and women had more fatty liver than either European men or women. So this was interesting. We're now moving from a simple waist to hip ratio to actually quantifying that this is ectopic fat, fat in the viscera, which can cause cardiometabolic issues. We went on to actually biopsy fat in muscle amongst all of our participants, and we looked at the fat cell size, and we can see these are subcutaneous abdominal fat samples that South Asians had larger adipocytes compared to Europeans, and this is known as adipocyte cell hypertrophy, as opposed to having more adipocytes themselves, which is called adipocyte hyperplasia. So the South Asians' adipocytes were bigger, filled with fat, and it appeared as though they couldn't expand the superficial fat stores, and then the fat and free fatty acids spilled over and settled in the viscera and went via the portal circulation to the liver. So South Asians have an inability to expand the superficial fat stores, whereas white Caucasians can do this quite easily. So when we put all of our SHARE and molecular SHARE data together, we see this fat overflow, as I mentioned, with superficial fat spilling into the viscera and the liver, this setting off a number of the cardiometabolic risk factors that we've measured and observed in population-based studies. And I'll mention that we measured in the muscle the presence of fat and tried to determine if this were associated with the cardiometabolic derangements we observed, but we did not see a significant association. We also are always asked the question about diet and the link between diet and these cardiometabolic factors. And I'm sure you've heard about this before and today. And in our earliest studies, we did observe that South Asians, no surprise, are more likely to be vegetarian and consume significantly more carbohydrates compared to Chinese and white Caucasian, significantly less protein, more simple sugar, and slightly more fat than the Chinese population. But overall, this pattern of more carbohydrate, less protein was observed then, and when we related the carbohydrate consumption to risk factors, we see higher carbohydrate intake associated with lower HDL and higher protein associated with lower waist to hip ratio. So this high carb consumption of South Asians is definitely linked to some and explains in part the cardiometabolic risk factors that we see in this population. Now, my colleague and mentor, Salim Youssef, took this observation further by conducting the Interheart Global Case Control Study of acute MI in 27,000 people. And in particular, he focused in on the South Asians. And I'll draw your attention to the left side of the slide, which shows the age of onset of first MI in South Asians is significantly younger compared to all other populations, with the exception of the Middle East, and that men suffered their MI about 10 years earlier than women. And then Dr. Joshi, together with the Interheart investigators, analyzed the data by comparing South Asians to all others and observed that the probability of a South Asian developing an MI before the age of 60 was significantly higher than compared to all others in the black bar. When he then adjusted that predicted probability for the Interheart risk factors, the difference went away. So essentially, the explanation for why South Asians develop MIs at younger ages is explained by the greater prevalence of risk factors at younger ages in South Asians compared to other groups. So when we look at Interheart and the impact of type 2 diabetes on acute MI, you can see that the odds ratios across the different groups are quite consistent between 2 and 3 when diabetes is present. When we look at both the controls and the cases in Interheart, we can see that the prevalence of diabetes is higher in South Asians at younger ages, even in the controls. So again, pointing to more diabetes, earlier age of onset, and greater chance of developing a myocardial infarction, in part due to the diabetes. So summing up what we have learned from our observational studies and the studies of others, South Asians have a higher frequency of metabolic syndrome-related factors. We're smaller statured but relatively more adipose. We have a propensity to expand our ectopic adipose stores, such as visceral fat, liver fat, but cannot expand our subcutaneous stores as well. The development of cardiovascular risk factors at earlier ages explains the early onset of MI in South Asians. And now the next set of studies are essentially designed to help us understand these observations. And that brings us to the birth cohort studies, the development of health and disease, or DOHAD type of research. And everyone in the UK is very familiar with the Barker hypothesis. And at the time we designed the South Asian birth cohort, there hadn't been many South Asian birth cohorts outside of India. You're familiar with the Bourne and Bradford cohort in Bradford, and the South Asian birth cohort was the first initiation of such a cohort in North America. And in Hamilton at McMaster, in our research group, we had the opportunity to compare our South Asian birth cohort with other birth cohorts in white Caucasians. So it allows us together to have 5,500 mum-baby pairs with a lot of ethnic variation. And through these comparisons of indigenous to South Asian to white Caucasian and Southeast Asian, we sometimes can learn clues that then help us understand the etiology of disease in a particular ethnic group. Now, we were funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Indian Council of Medical Research to create an urban Canada South Asian birth cohort, and we've recruited 1,012 mother-baby pairs. And then with our colleagues at St. John's Medical College in Bangalore, we've created an urban and a rural village birth cohort for our comparison populations. What we've observed when we compare our South Asian mothers in Canada to the white Caucasians in Canada is South Asians have lower pre-pregnancy BMI, yet more gestational diabetes, again a similar pattern to what we had observed in adults, South Asians compared to white Caucasians. The South Asian babies are born significantly lower birth weight compared to the white Caucasian babies, yet have more body fat at birth, and this is measured using skin fold thickness. So this again is showing that our South Asian babies have the thin fat phenotype from birth. What we have observed in adults with the Yajnik-Yadkin slide is present at birth in the South Asian babies born in Canada. This is a similar story, and now I'll move to comparing our South Asian birth cohort in Canada to rural and urban Indian women and their offspring. And no surprise to you, as we move from rural to urban Canada, we can see an increase in the pre-pregnancy BMI, which is quite striking. This is correlated with an increase in gestational diabetes, and using international standard criteria, the prevalence of GDM in South Asian moms in Canada is 25%. If we use South Asian specific criteria as developed by the Bourne and Bradford cohort, this goes up to 33%. So 33% of our South Asian women in Canada are developing gestational diabetes. When we look at the birth weight correlates with the mom's pre-pregnancy BMI and also whether or not she developed GDM. Now, we published a paper where we looked at the determinants of gestational diabetes in the South Asian moms, and we also looked to see offspring characteristics comparing gestational diabetic moms versus no GDM. And you can see the birth weight of GDM moms is significantly greater. That would be expected based on what we've all learned and understood about gestational diabetes. The gestational diabetic babies are greater in terms of their percent body fat. And when we measured cord blood glucose and insulin, we can see that babies of mothers with gestational diabetes have higher insulin at birth, meaning that their fetal pancreases were working overtime in utero to control their glucose. So we're already seeing evidence of, excess insulin at birth amongst these children. So if it's true that the birth exposure can program certain metabolic processes, babies or offspring of mothers with GDM have already started this process. And depending on the environment they are then exposed to, they may or may not develop early onset cardiometabolic factors. Now, this is where we start to think about how omics, be it genomics, epigenomics, metabolomics, can inform our understanding of some of these observations. And whenever we present the excess type 2 diabetes data in South Asians or gestational diabetes data, people say, well, it must be due to a genetic cause. And we know that from many now large collaborations that ancestry is tightly linked to genetics. So self-reporting ethnicity of being South Asian would likely end me up in the cluster of people who originate from India, and then we can look at the relatedness of individuals. And you can see that the circle around the Indian cline is reasonably close to the European origin cluster. And there has been some incredible work in this area by Priya Moorjani and David Reich from the United States, where they have very painstakingly subclassified South Asians as certainly North Indian versus South Indian, but they do make the point that in their ancient DNA analyses, all South Asians have a degree of admixture. And then when the caste system was imposed and marriages occurred within castes, that actually created an endogamous population similar to a bottleneck, which led to an excess prevalence of recessive alleles in South Asians. And we often think about recessive alleles as causing significant or severe syndromes, and some have been identified in South Asians, but likely this has also led to an increased prevalence of risk alleles for some of the cardiometabolic factors, and that's what we're trying to understand now. Now, if we look at the worldwide type 2 diabetes burden, as I've already showed you, but then say to ourselves, well, South Asians are represented in the orange here, the proportion in the world of individuals who have type 2 diabetes, and then ask ourselves what proportion of the South Asians have had genome-wide association data collected, it's much lower. So if I could just show the proportion of South Asians with diabetes is up here, and the proportion with GWAS is down here, and gray is representing South Asians, and orange is representing Europeans, you can see that Europeans have had significantly more GWASs performed and conducted. And this can be converted into something that we call participation to prevalence ratio. So you essentially look at the ratio of the proportion with GWAS to the proportion with type 2 diabetes, and you're doing well if you hit a PPR of 1. But in fact, when we look at the South Asians and the proportion who have had GWAS data collected, it's very, very low compared to white Caucasians, which reach a PPR of close to 5. So we only have part of the story when it comes to genetic associations of some of these cardiometabolic risk factors, and we need more large cohort data to really understand these issues better. Within our DREAM and EpiDREAM prospective cohorts, we did look at candidate genes that had GWAS wide or level significance for type 2 diabetes within 3 groups. We looked within the Europeans, the South Asians, and the Latino population, and this gene score, a marker of genetic load, was associated with an increased incidence of type 2 diabetes, and the associations were quite consistent across the different ethnic groups. At the bottom part of the slide, I do show the impact of self-reported family history, which is actually a pretty good crude surrogate of genetic load. So we're asking individuals and comparing those who have one parent with type 2 diabetes versus both parents with type 2 diabetes, and you can see their gene score increases when they have more first-degree relatives with type 2 diabetes. So a relatively useful way of assessing, in a crude manner, genetic load. We've looked at whether or not the genome-wide SNPs found in white Caucasians are also predictive within South Asians, and in the overlap component of the Venn diagram, you can see that we share many of the same genetic polymorphisms associated with type 2 DM, but there are unique or potentially novel variants in South Asians that require large data sets to really decipher. And this work is happening now in part through the Diamante collaboration, which I'll get to soon. When we created a gene score to look at the association of genetic variants with gestational diabetes, we used a newer approach whereby we can use over 1 million SNPs as we can derive them from the diagram type 2 diabetes collaboration, and then impute the 1,000 genomes data to come up with not a 15 SNP gene score, but over 1 million SNPs. And when we applied these data to our South Asian birth cohort and look at the genetic prediction of gestational diabetes, over and above the known factors, which include family history, older age, pre-pregnancy BMI, and low-quality diet, when we add in the gene score data, we can see that the genetic information is associated with a population attributable risk on GDM of about 35%. So there is a significant genetic component to mothers who develop GDM, and we know GDM is a risk factor for developing full-blown type 2 diabetes in both the mother and the offspring. We're now doing work to try and understand if we can modify the high-risk individuals by gene score based on whether or not they have healthy lifestyle characteristics. And in our early analyses, we see that individuals who consume high diet quality have a reduced risk of elevated glucose even when they have a high genetic load. So I think we'll be doing more work in this area, trying to see if we can modify predetermined genetic load for diabetes. I mentioned the Diamante collaboration, really led by John Chambers and Jaspal Kuner, whereby they've collected a lot of South Asian specific GWAS data from cohorts around the world, and we have participated in this with the InterHeart and the EpiDream cohorts. And these analyses, when we can increase the sample size now into the 16,000 cases and 30,000 controls, are starting to yield evidence of novel variants associated with type 2 diabetes within the South Asian population. Now, what about methylation pattern differences? We know from other famine birth cohorts, and by that an example would be the Dutch hunger winter in World War II, where pregnant Dutch women food supply were restricted, and the work done in that population showing thereafter their offspring develop an early onset metabolic syndrome type picture. And methylation studies have shown that certain genes are differentially methylated, like insulin growth factor 1, for example. So we're interested in trying to understand if South Asians have some differentially methylated regions that explain the persistence of this low birth weight phenotype. And David Leon in the UK has published this, showing that in South Asians in the UK, this low birth weight phenotype persists beyond the first generation, but continues into the second. So at the present time, there are multiple groups, just like genomics was about 10 years ago, starting to do EWAS studies, so epigenome-wide association studies. There are not very many South Asian cohorts. We're working in this area, Bourne and Bradford's working in this area, and some groups in India, but we really need to get into the thousands of samples to be able to look at this in more detail. There was recently in a non-South Asian birth cohort consortium a nice meta-analysis showing that they identified over 900 sites that were differentially methylated in the genome associated with birth weight. So I think there's a great potential for the future here for us to try and understand these potential epigenetic marks that affect gene expression and traits such as birth weight and hyperglycemia. The gut microbiome, just to provide a quick snapshot into this, this is an area that everybody's interested in, but there are still some limitations in terms of understanding what the data means. Within our South Asian birth cohort and another primarily white Caucasian birth cohort in Canada called CHILD, we analyzed the infant microbiome at 1 year of age. And it's fairly easy to collect these samples because the mother just needs to collect up the diaper and put it in the freezer, and then we can collect the sample and do the metagenomics from there. And in this paper led by a researcher in our group, Jennifer Stearns, we demonstrated that there are unique features of the South Asian infant microbiome that are influenced by whether or not the baby is breastfed versus bottle fed, and also associated with weight gain in the first year of life. We identified that there were some differences, whereas you may have heard that mother's antibiotic exposure and cesarean section are determinants of the infant microbiome. We observed that within the white Caucasians, but not within the South Asians. And in particular, we observed that lactobacilli seemed to be an important species that was quite predominant within the South Asian infants. So more work required here, really moving beyond ethnic comparisons and focusing in just on the South Asian infants and linking that to their diet and the maternal or family diet. In metabolomics, we are looking within our mothers with gestational diabetes to see if we can identify a metabolomic signature associated with gestational diabetes. And we're doing this in the South Asian birth cohort and the family birth cohort, again, predominantly white Caucasian, so we have this comparison. And we have just begun this work, but we can see that there are, again, with a Venn diagram, some already identified metabolomic measures, hydroxybutyric acid, that are common to both South Asians and white Caucasians. But there's a whole group here in the green circle that seem to be potentially unique to the South Asians. And our approach to these analyses are to analyze each cohort separately and then meta-analyze across the cohorts and see if we see consistency across cohorts for certain metabolites. So we're working in this area and particularly interested in some of the branch chain amino acids, although they have not emerged at this time. And then as I come to the intervention component and close the omics component of this presentation, I adapted this slide from Mark McCarthy's slide, where he presents the potential risks that individuals face for type 2 diabetes as almost like a palette of pathways, a painter's palette of different pathways, from beta cell dysfunction to adipose tissue dysfunction to insulin resistance. And the same may be thought of in the case of the South Asian riddle of why these risk factors are more prevalent in South Asians. And it may not be, we know for sure it won't be a one gene discovery. The gene data show that we have multiple genes across the genome affected. And also a load of more of these factors and therefore develop diabetes earlier on, and others have very few, and if living in optimal lifestyle conditions may not develop diabetes or other risk factors. When we move to interventions, I think that's the big challenge. We know so much about the risk factors for gestational diabetes, the potential programming effect of gestational diabetes on offspring, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. The key is really to try and prevent and intervene early enough to prevent individuals and their offspring from developing these conditions. And so, we can think about breaking out of the bottleneck and promoting, widespread admixture. It's never very popular with my South Asian audiences, but that's one option. The other would be to think about lifestyle interventions and some of our excellent prescription medications. I won't go into the prescription medications in detail today, but I will say that things such as the TZDs, as we observed in the DREAM clinical trial, are very effective in preventing diabetes in individuals who are at risk for diabetes. But most populations who feel relatively healthy, they know that they have a risk for diabetes, are not keen to take medications, and that really leaves us focusing on some of the lifestyle changes. And recently, my master's student, Janil Lambachia, did a systematic review of diet and physical activity interventions in South Asians, and these pooled together randomized trial data to see if risk factors are altered by these types of interventions. And essentially, there's no strong data supporting a combined diet and physical activity intervention, but I will say there are limitations of the randomized trials done to date. They're relatively small, and there have been different outcomes assessed across the trials. There's a greater signal when we look at diet-only interventions. So these are diet-only randomized trials conducted in South Asians. And using data from 8 trials and about 800 participants, we can see that dietary interventions are associated with reductions in certain risk factors, including LDL cholesterol, and fasting plasma glucose. And if we drill down into these interventions and say, like, what are the drivers of the effect of these interventions, we can look at data from other trials that are supportive. So in this trial from a group in Israel published in Circulation, they really evaluated well the impact of a low carbohydrate diet in a randomized trial in terms of its impact on glucose, other metabolic parameters, but also they performed MRI of ectopic fat and demonstrated that the low carbohydrate diet was associated with significant reductions. You can see, if you just look at the green in the abdominal fat MRI cross-section at baseline to end of intervention, a reduction in visceral fat and also a reduction in liver fat. And they were trying to minimize weight loss in this change. So the diet impacts the ectopic fat loss. And when they looked at the impact of physical activity, it was additive to the low-carb diet, but the main driver was the low-carb diet. So I think that's one of the best trial evidence we have that supports a low-carbohydrate diet leading to positive cardiometabolic change. We are starting a randomized trial to prevent gestational diabetes in South Asians in Canada. My colleague Russell D'Souza has this trial underway, and women who are early in their pregnancy are randomized to digital health coaching with an optimal diet intervention and maximal physical activity in terms of steps walked per day compared to usual care. And we have heard from the South Asian women in Canada that when they go to see their primary care physicians, they don't really get specific advice. They're just told they're at risk and come back for their oral glucose tolerance test. And they seem to be craving some specific advice to help them minimize the risk of GDM. So this trial called DAISY GDM is designed to do that, and it's underway now. We're also kind of embarking on some novel ways of health communication. Our old ways, such as, I even think email is old now, but letter writing, email communication, telephone calls is not as impactful and rapid as perhaps using social media. And we know just with Instagram that people can switch around messages very quickly, as well as with apps like WhatsApp. It's very commonly used in the South Asian population in Canada. So we're trying to look at social networks in the South Asian community as a mode through which we can send health messages. And then our goal is to develop a social network intervention whereby we continually use these positive health messages around healthy, active living with the hopes that that leads in a primary prevention population to positive change. So to summarize, South Asians have excess adiposity, type 2 diabetes, and early cardiovascular disease. These risk factor trajectories are influenced by early life exposures, even the exposures of the pregnant mother, the in utero exposures, and then life thereafter. The low carbohydrate diet and high physical activity are effective ways to prevent adiposity accumulation. And our ancient Hindu texts actually promote a lot of the things that we are promoting when we talk about healthy active living as a means to prevent diabetes in South Asians. So I would stop there, and I would thank many, many collaborators from home and abroad in making this research happen and successful. And again, I thank you for this opportunity.
Sonia, that was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I hope all our listeners agree that you were a worthy recipient of the award. Extensive program of work, novel insights into the increased risk of metabolic health in South Asians. I really like the personal connections. Bazim and I got the award last year, and we talked about our personal connections, and I think all of us have a story to tell. And some of the work that you've shown also resonates with the increased association in South Asians with COVID at an early age as well, possibly. You mentioned Ranjan Yagnik. I can see he's one of the delegates. He's still on the list at the moment, so I'm sure he'll be clapping away as well. But again, thank you so much. I'm going to hand you over to Wazim to say a few words and then close the conference. Your award is with your PA. It will be handed over to you. It's already there, yes. So it will be handed over to you when you get to work tomorrow, I hope. So again, Sonia, thank you so much for everything. Oh, have you got it? She's showing it. I think she's already got it.
I do have
Oh, that'd be good.
Yeah, I do. That'd be good. So
Oh.
thank you very much.
Oh, great.
That's
Wonderful.
wonderful. Thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Great.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Sonia.
I'll hand you over to Dadra. Azim.
So thank you very much, Sonia. I think it was absolutely amazing. We have waited for you for about a decade. I don't know. The last time we invited you, we had the volcano was exploding, and this time is the pandemic. But it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. So thank you very much, and we are absolutely delighted that you have accepted this award. And we have got a big list, a huge connection with McMaster. Salim has been with us for at least twice, and he got the Lifetime Achievement Award. So we are really grateful and honored for you to having accepted this award, and hoping to see you in person so that you can join with our Bangla. That's where we do our physical activity at the next conference, probably sometime in the future. So thank you very much. So my job is also to close the conference. So let me take this opportunity, first of all, to thank all the speakers and chairs. They have been absolutely brilliant for having to taking their time and to have made the presentations, and most importantly, to stick to the time. I also want to thank the lovely delegates. You know, I think we had more than nearly 600 delegates registered, and people came in and came out of the conference, which is understandable. And I'm going to try and give them an idea about how we're going to do it. So I have got to thank a lot of people. So if you bear me and be with me for the next couple of minutes, I'll be really appreciate. So the first person I really want to thank is Rajvinder Gill, who is the General Manager for the SAHF. She is the woman behind the scene. What we have done today, what we've achieved today, right from the sponsorship to the conference to delegates, she handles this. So a big thank you on behalf of SAHF, on behalf of the trustees, and we are really, really grateful. The second people I want to really thank is the EACME team. These are the people who provided us the technical support and managed to run this conference almost smoothly, because this was the first virtual conference. We had a lot of anxiety, but really thankful to Anand Mishra, who heads the EACME based in Glasgow, along with his Indian counterparts, Amit Arora, Bimalendu Kunar, and Venkatesh Sharma. So we could see their names. So a big thank you to all, and we really appreciate it. Whenever we do a conference of SAHF, it is never possible to do it without our wonderful industry sponsors, and we are really grateful for them to have made it possible in this virtual world. So first of all, I would like to thank our gold sponsors, Novo Nordisk, for the generous support. I would with the symposium, and also want to like to thank Abbott for the silver sponsorship and for doing the ethnicity and COVID symposium. I also would like to thank Boehringer Ingelheim, who have been our bronze sponsors, and the other sponsors who have contributed have been AstraZeneca, NAP, and Mylan. One of the things it's very important we have always done at the SAHF is to do an evaluation forms and to get your feedback, because that helps us to plan future conferences. So can you please do that, and that will be very, very helpful. Now, one of the things that has been mentioned by a lot of delegates, both on the Twitter, if they could not attend all the sessions, and in the feedback, Now, all these sessions will be available on the SAHF website, and you'll get an email from Raj about how to access this. So these will be available on demand at least till the end of February. So you please go and listen to any of the talks if you have missed by any chance. And finally, we have got this conference virtually, and if things are good, maybe our next conference will be in person. That will be next year. But I think one of the other conferences that we have in usually before Ramadan is our SAHF and DAR, Diabetes and Ramadan International Conference. It looks like it's going to be virtual, so please register for that conference as it is quite an important agenda on the calendar. Finally, I would like to thank the Board of Trustees, right starting from the Chairman, Professor Kiran Patel, along with our new trustees, Sarah Ali, Kiran Semi, Harpreet Sood, Vinod Patel, who was chaired. I'm sure the next meeting there will be lots of talks by him. Paramjit Gill and Ranjit Dillon for providing the steer and leadership. So on that positive note, I wouldn't say drive safely, but stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask, and hopefully we will see you in better times. So thank you and good evening, good night.